Hey, welcome back to 316, a Bible study of Bridgeway Church out of Tampa, Florida. My name is Joel Eason, and I'm really excited and honored that you're with us. As always, if you're a regular, we love having you. Let us know that you're there. But if you're new, we'd love to have you connect with our channel, like and subscribe to our channel, simply because we do these Bible studies each week, as well as our Sunday morning services are offered on this channel, and we'd love to have you be a part of the Bridgeway family. Now, if possibly you're asking why we call it 316, we're connected to 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 16 and 17, reminding us that all of Scripture is God-breathed and it's useful and profitable for us in so many different ways, but certainly in teaching and rebuking, correcting, and to be trained in righteousness, in order that you and I can follow the Lord with our full lives. And so in these studies, we like to take a verse by verse. There are certainly times that we'll paraphrase as we need to, but we like to go verse by verse. And we find ourselves in the book of Acts. We're getting in the back section now. We're going to be in chapter 17 and chapter 18, and we're in what is considered Paul's second missionary journey. Now, I'm going to go ahead and flip over to our primary look. So far, where we've watched the Apostle Paul has been in chapter 13 and 14. Certainly, there were things before that with the early church growing and getting established in Jerusalem, the persecution causing this exodus out of Jerusalem up towards Antioch of Syria. And we've covered all of those chapters. Paul has this massive conversion in chapter 9. But he begins his missionary journeys in chapter 13 and 14 with Barnabas. And they went to Cyprus and then up into Galatia. So the towns that the book of Acts identifies is Antioch of Pisidia, Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe. But that's all in the southern portion of Galatia. So when Paul will write the letter to the Galatians, it's not just the southern portion, but it certainly includes them. After chapter 14 concludes, Paul and Barnabas go to Antioch and then down to Jerusalem for this famous council. And then they come back up to Antioch. Paul has the idea, let's go visit the brothers that we visited in chapter 13, 14. And there ends up being this split. I won't go into the details, but they decide to part ways. And Barnabas goes back to Cyprus with his cousin John Mark, and Paul's going to go north to his hometown in Cilicia, Tarsus, and then he's going to go over to Galatia, and he's traveling with Timothy, he's traveling with Silas, and they're going to arrive in Philippi in chapter 16. And our last time talking together, we were in Thessalonica and Berea. And so let me show you just a quick map of that second trip. Paul had gone from Antioch, which is a town just above my image, the photo of me. Look north of that in Syria, you'll see Antioch. They go to Tarsus, which was in the region of Cilicia. Then they travel to these green southern portion of Galatia, Derbe, Lystra, Iconium, Antioch of Pisidia. And then you see Phrygia or Phrygia. I've heard it said both ways. Just keep that in mind for the very end, because we'll see that the scripture is going to say at the end of Acts chapter 18 that Paul goes back to this area, Phrygia, and so that you'll know where we're talking about. Now, I also want you to just take a mental snapshot of something. Look north of that area and you see Bithynia and Pontus. So we're going to get introduced to a man and a woman, a husband and a wife named Aquila and Priscilla. And the scripture is going to identify that they are from Pontus. They're from that north area that's in a light green color. Okay, so just file that away. So back with Paul, they're going to travel over to the northern part of Asia, to Mysia, and then Troas, over to Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea, and where we're picking up, if you're coming, let's say if this was a clock, you're looking at about 10 o'clock, so it would be actually that way, 10 o'clock. Paul's going to be coming down to Athens, then into Corinth, and we'll see him touch Ephesus and then finish things off coming all the way to Caesarea. So we're going to see all of that in this particular talk tonight. So let's go ahead and jump back to our verses and we'll jump in. It says from chapter 17, when the Jews in Thessalonica learned that Paul was preaching the word of God at Berea, they went there too, agitating the crowd, stirring them up. The brothers immediately sent Paul to the coast, but Silas and Timothy stayed at Berea. The men who escorted Paul brought him to Athens and then left with instructions for Silas and Timothy to join him as soon as possible. So the trouble of Thessalonica travels over to Berea, and then from Berea, Paul's going to leave, go back towards the Aegean Sea, going to come down into Athens, while Silas and Timothy remained up in that area with instructions, when you can, come visit us. Now, so we're going to look primarily at Athens and Corinth, Athens and Corinth tonight. So talking about Athens as a town or a city, there certainly was a culture. It's common today that cities have culture to them. And you could be a part of the Greek Empire or part of the Roman Empire and still have a very unique culture in your city. Well, Athens certainly had a culture, and I'm leaning on 5 things that were present in the Athenian culture: philosophy, democracy, science, arts, and architecture. And that's not to say that these weren't in other places within the Greek Empire or the Roman Empire that followed the Greek Empire, but it certainly was prominent there in Athens. So we're going to kind of look at these before we get into the verses in Scripture. So with philosophy, you've heard about the famous Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. They were the 3 leading philosophers, but philosophers as a whole was a prominent position or a very esteemed person. If you were a philosopher in Athens, that carried a lot of regard, but certainly there were more prominent figures, and we know Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle were at the front of that. This is a very religious community. Very pagan though, so a lot of idolatry, and I'll show you some things in just a second. So just because they were spiritual, believing that the gods existed, it did not mean that it was a biblical approach. It was a very pagan approach, and so we'll lean onto that in a second. They were highly influenced by both Greek mythology and Roman mythology. Okay, so just file that away for a second. In the way of democracy, you had a particular Cleisthenes who in around 507, 510 BC, he was considered the father of Athenian democracy. So it's helpful to keep in mind in that ancient time period where you had empires and you had monarchs and you had kings and you had rulers. Most groups of people were led either by monarchy or oligarchy. An oligarchy was just a small group that ruled. So it might be a few people, it might be a council, but it was a small group. The common person didn't have a voice. So one of the famous things with Cleisthenes is he begins this process in Athens of the people having a voice, people being invited to assembly, people being invited to dialogue and debate public matters as to what rule would be. So he was very influential in democracy, and it's helpful to keep in mind that Athens became very influential with democracy in a time period of history in which it was not prominent or present. With science, you have different disciplines: mathematics, astronomy, medicine, engineering. If you've heard of the Pythagorean theorem in math, Pythagoras came from Athens. There was a lot of prominent uh, advancement, that's the word I'm looking for, advancement in intellectual studies that came out of Athens. When it comes to plays, you think about Iliad and Homer, or Iliad and Odyssey coming from Homer. Greece was so prominent with plays and poets. And there in Athens, Athens had contributions from Sophocles and Euripides, who wrote many plays. So you're just kind of getting this melting pot of a culture. And then you have the architecture, and that would be the most famous were the Acropolis and the Parthenon and the Areopagus, and that was all together. And I'm sure you've seen these before, but let me show you what we're talking about with this. So this is just kind of a rendering in Athens of what it would look like, in that ancient time period. The Acropolis, acro meaning high, it's a high place. This was just a high mountain or high hill that lots of thinking and worshiping and gathering happened. So atop the Acropolis was the Parthenon. That's the most famous structure that happened up there, or on top of the Acropolis. And it was a place of worship. It was a place of gathering, but it was a place of worship. And I'll show you something about it in just a second. And then down below, you had the Areopagus. So that is going to be very important for us understanding when we look at what Paul says in Athens, because he is going to talk from the Areopagus. What you see depicted in drawing is where Paul is going to do his Acts 17 teaching. So the Parthenon, this is a present day look. There's renovations. Athens has been the site of many, many battles over the years. So a lot of destruction, and there's process of renovation. But let me show you something inside the Parthenon. Inside the Parthenon was a statue to the goddess Athena. Athena is where Athens gets its name. So the Parthenon was a place of worship. Now, on one side, you'll see that it's kind of a drawing, a rendering of what it would have looked like. And there has been a recreation, not in Athens, but this is actually, I think, in the U.S. But there's a recreation of what the Parthenon would have looked like, both inside and outside. And so you have, if you'll notice, the size of the man in relation to the statue to Athena. So just keep that in mind when Paul's going to talk about the true God doesn't live in a temple made by human hands. One of the things that would happen with ancient cultures, is they would take their statues and they would coat them, and the exterior would be gold, and they would use that often as part of a treasury chest in times of war. It was how they would create commerce off of the gold on their statues or on their idols. So that's interesting to look. But let me show you one more picture here. So this is a photo standing on the Areopagus looking up at present-day Acropolis. And then beside it, you'll see a photo from the Acropolis looking down on the Areopagus. So I just want you to kind of capture that this is all very close to one another. And this was the site of so much culture within Athens. Now I'll show you one more thing. Athens was also known for war. So if you've ever heard of the Greco-Persian Wars, Sparta versus Persia. If you ever watched the movie 300 and King Leonidas and his battle with Artaxerxes. Well, a lot of that happened around Athens. So in the campaign of the Greco-Persian Wars, when Artaxerxes attacks all of Greece, you'll see that there are 5 things highlighted here. The real famous one, the real famous battle that the movie 300 is Thermopylae, and so that would be number 2 on your screen. But you'll see that Athens and Corinth are right in the thick of it. And you have the very famous battle and the messenger out of Marathon, where we get the name Marathon, running the great distance. So anyway, you have Athens and you have Corinth, the place of our study tonight, really in the heartbeat of this Greek culture that's marked by so many different things. That's marked by, not only battle, but architecture. That's influenced by education and intellect, the battles, as I said. So there's a lot that will show up, I think, as we read Paul's words. So it says, when Paul was waiting for them, we're in Acts 6:17, when Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was greatly distressed to see that the city was full of idols. So pause here. You'll see this really prominently in Ephesus when we touch that next week. But it was true in Athens as well. When people would travel to Athens and they would visit the Parthenon and worship at this great statue of Athena, people would buy trinkets and, that would travel home with them. Think about, let's say, present day. If you go to the Eiffel Tower, you probably buy a little Eiffel Tower to take home with you. When people travel to the Statue of Liberty, they either get a t-shirt or they get a little trinket. If they go to the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco, they get a little trinket of the bridge. So there were all kinds of reproduction of trinket idols for people that would travel and would want to worship in their homes. So he says here, he was greatly distressed to see that the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and the God-fearing Greeks, as well as in the marketplace, day by day with those who happened to be there. So the custom of Paul was to always start in synagogues and teach there amongst the Jews and God-fearing Gentiles. Why? Because they already know the scriptures. They know the scriptures, and he is taking the scriptures and pointing to Jesus being the Messiah and the fulfillment of that. To teach in the marketplace, which he would do regularly, he is not leaning into Isaiah, and he's not leaning into Deuteronomy, and he's not leaning into the Torah, because the Gentiles in the marketplace most likely didn't know a lot of the scriptures. So he starts in synagogues where he can leverage the scriptures and point them towards Christ in order to start to build a Christ-centered Christian nucleus to build and grow a church in that community from. But he will also do what is like street evangelism, going in the marketplace and talking with people in relation to what they felt and thought and pointing them to Christ. And I think we see some of that here in Athens. So a group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers began to dispute with him. Pause here. So let me show you something. I'll come back. Epicurean, the goal of the Epicureans was pleasure. And virtue stood in the way of that. For you to live as an Epicurean, it was what is pleasing, and that's the goal of life. If you were a Stoic, virtue was the goal of life, not pleasure. Pleasure often stood in opposition to living out virtue. And you can think, just looking at the screen, we see this in our present day. We have people that say, man, just live how you want to live. You should be happy, do what you want to do. That's Epicurean. And then there are other people, no, you should live according to virtue, even at your own detriment, even to your own chagrin. It's not about happiness, it's about holiness, and that would be Stoic. So you have these two groups represented in Athens, and they were always in debate with one another, and they are going to debate. They're both going to come at Paul. So it says that these philosophers began to dispute with him. Some of them asked, "What is this babbler trying to say?" Others remarked, "He seems to be advocating foreign gods." They said this because Paul was preaching the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. So let me lean on that. So once again, they did not know about Jesus, and they most likely did not know much about Jehovah, Yahweh, the Old Testament. So for them, they're hearing these teachings and thinking, I don't even know what you're talking about. And so they're so confused that they're going to call him to come to the Areopagus to dialogue where dialogue and debate happened and to defend what he's even talking about. So picking up in verse 19, then they took him and brought him to a meeting of the Areopagus, so the place that you saw, where they said to him, "May we know what this new teaching is that you're presenting? You're bringing some strange ideas to our ears. We want to know what they mean." And then Luke, who's the author of the book of Acts, gives us just some insight about Athenian culture. All the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there spent their time doing nothing but talking about and listening to the latest ideas. So they're just, if you were a speculative person, there was an esteem to that. Today would be like, okay, enough of your ideas, just get to work. For this Athenian culture, a lot of what they did was just dialogue and debate about concepts. Now, they're at the Areopagus. You'll probably hear and see the phrase Mars Hill. Mars Hill and the Areopagus are the same place. And why the two names? Well, Greek mythology has the god of war named as Ares. And so the Areopagus literally means the hill of Ares. And with Roman mythology, Ares was defined as Mars. And so you would have the hill of Mars, or Mars Hill. So Areopagus and Mars Hill are the same place. You're just pulling, one is pulling on Greek mythology, the other is pulling on Roman mythology. So keep going. Paul then stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said, "Men of Athens, I see that in every way you're very religious. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God.' Now what you worship as something unknown, I'm going to proclaim to you." Now pause here, let me insert this. So in Greek mythology and Roman mythology, there was the idea that gods were not eternal, gods were not pre-existent, that there was the formation of gods, that gods beget gods, and that a human might even have the capacity of becoming a god. So there was this outside concept in the Athenian culture and Greek culture that there might be gods that we don't know about. And you want to keep in mind they are very, very close to Berea. And Berea, just outside of Berea, was Mount Olympus. Let me show you this photo here. So this is a photo from Thessalonica, which is just close to Berea, and that big mountain in the back is Mount Olympus. And Mount Olympus was considered to be the home of the gods, where Zeus or where Jupiter remain, where Athena would go, and the council of the gods, and Ares or Mars, whichever name you were using, and the council of gods would take place there at Mount Olympus. So you come back to this concept where they are saying there might be some we don't know about, so we don't want to be accountable for what we don't know. So there's an inscription for an unknown God that maybe we're accountable to, and we don't even know who it is. Paul is going to lean into this. He says, "The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples built by hands." Pause. They're in Athens, Parthenon, large statue to Athena. Across the Aegean Sea is Ephesus, and their very big temple to Diana. And he is saying in the Greek culture, the Roman culture, God doesn't live in temples built by hands. And he's going to lean into how they think as philosophers. He is not served by human hands as if he needed anything, because he himself gives all men life and breath and everything else. So he doesn't need what you are offering him. I was in Hong Kong years and years and years ago with my wife, and we were around a variety of Buddhist temples and a variety of various, temples of worship, false worship. But it was very common. We watched this be very common, that if people had idols, even in the streets, I remember distinctly watching in a marketplace where there was an arrangement of idols, and people were literally leaving sacks of food and fruit at the idols. It was as though the gods needed the food. And Paul is leaning into that concept that prevails in pagan cultures. God doesn't need what you have prepared. He says, in verse 26, from one man he made every nation of men that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he determined the time set for them and the exact places where they should live. God did this so that men would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he's not far from each one of us. That's important. Because once again, in ancient culture, the feeling of maybe the gods are very far away, and we have to beckon them, and we have to entertain them and solicit them, and we have to warrant their appeasement of us, that they don't judge us and destroy us, but we beckon them. And Paul is saying, God is not far from us. And then he does something masterful. He uses their own language. So these two lines in red, for in him we live, move, and have our being, and then also we are his offspring, came from Athenian poetry. And he's doing that so that he can leverage their own thinking. So he says, therefore, since we're God's offspring, like y'all believe this. And it's true, we are God's offspring, but not as you think. But he's leaning into what they held as true. Since we are God's offspring, we should not think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image made by man's design and skill. If we're his offspring, we're not made that way. Wait a minute. So he is leaning into a philosophical approach. He's not leaning into Deuteronomy. He's not leaning into Leviticus as he would have done in a synagogue. He is leaning into their ration and their philosophy. In the past, God overlooked such ignorance, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent, for he has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. He has given proof of this to all men by raising him from the dead. Now, once again, remember, earlier it said he was preaching the good news of Jesus Christ and the resurrection, to which Epicureans and Stoics, what's this babbler talking about? You're presenting some strange ideas. Come to the Areopagus and defend your teachings. And so when he is saying he has given proof of this to all men by raising him from the dead, he has already been talking to them about Jesus, and he is talking to them once again, not about Leviticus, not about Exodus. He is talking about God come into the world, Savior who died in our behalf, the good news, and the power of the resurrection. It says when they heard this about the resurrection of the dead, some of them sneered. Like, that's not an Athenian culture. That's not what happened. Is that a person dies and comes back to life. At the highest in Athenian culture, somebody might die and be elevated to the gods, but to be resurrected. So that's why they sneer here. That still happens to this day, right? You talk to people and somebody sneers about your confidence in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And it says here, we want to hear you again on this subject. At that, Paul left the council. Few men became followers of Paul and believed. Among them was Dionysius, a member of the Areopagus, also a woman named Damaris, and a number of others. But it appears that he's not going to spend a whole lot of time in Athens, because the very next verse is Acts chapter 18, and it tells us after this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. So there's not much that we have after that. Paul doesn't write a letter to a church in Athens. He will write a letter to a church in Corinth that we're going to look into. But he is not going to write a letter to a church in Athens. So now there is evidence of churches being established, certainly in Athens, churches of antiquity. So we know that there was impact and growth that followed after Paul. But from here, he's going to leave. How long he was in Athens, that's debatable. But he's going to come to Corinth, and Corinth was a city of great culture also. Just like Athens had culture, Corinth had culture. Where Athens had kind of this very intellectual culture, Corinth had a very immoral, pleasure, hedonistic culture. So we'll lean in on a couple of things here. So Corinth was a key cosmopolitan city in ancient Greece. It had temples, multiple temples, had theaters, agora. The word for a marketplace in the ancient was an agora. And Corinth was considered to be the master of two harbors. So let me show you some photos about Corinth now. So when you talk about master of two harbors, you have this very thin isthmus, this strip. So what you would have from looking at this photo, what would be at the top part of that landmass, that would be Greece, and if you were to follow the Saronic Gulf around, you would come towards Athens. If you were to come in the south part, you would have Achaia. So in Achaia was where we saw where Sparta was from. So that Achaia side. But you had the Gulf of Corinth and the Saronic Gulf, and you just have a very few mile, just like 3-4 mile strip separating these. So if you think about one thing that was prominent in Corinth was this Diolkos, which was a road that ships would come into the Gulf of Corinth and then would literally be carried and rolled across. You see this road, you can travel there to this day and see ancient stones of the Diolkos in which ships would be hoisted upon rollers and would be rolled to the Saronic Gulf. Now, in this industry, because coming around Achaia introduced all kinds of heavy weather and calamities that were possible. So this was a much faster, much safer route to come across the Diolkos. It took thousands upon thousands upon thousands of workers to work the Diolkos for so many ships. So this was a very vibrant business and a very prominent way of employment. And if you worked for somebody, you would find yourself as their slave. Very few people in Corinth were native to Corinth. You had a lot of travelers that would come and would work on the Diolkos. Now, a couple things also about Corinth is Corinth had a high place. That's called the Acrocorinth. Remember, acro is high. And up on top of the Acrocorinth was a temple to Aphrodite. At the temple of Aphrodite, there was not just legalized prostitution, there was worship prostitution. There was men and women, lots of immoral fornication and sex and adultery. To Corinthianize a person, or to be a Corinthian woman, was to be a very promiscuous person. This was part of the Corinthian culture, so it was permissible to live immoral. Once again, they're more Epicurean about pleasure. And you'll even see some of what Paul writes in his letters, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, that he's addressing immorality. So he's going to write, do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit? He's going to talk about when you engage in, I'm going to use the phrase sexual affair with somebody outside the scope of marriage. He's going to talk about you become bonded to them. He raises the necessity of morality in Corinth. Paul does. But you also had Temple of Apollo. You had a lot of pagan worship that took place here. Now let me show you one more. So you see that Achaia, and you see Greece and where Athens is, just down on the kind of northeast side of the Saronic Gulf. The reason I'm pointing at Olympia, which was on Achaia, and Corinth, is Corinth hosted what's called the Isthmian Games. They were second only to the Olympian Games. You and I are very familiar with the Olympics. Had it not been for the games in Olympia, what we might watch every couple years or every 4 years would be the Isthmian Games. But because the Olympia Games became a little more prominent, eventually the Isthmian Games fell away. But they were a rival. So I say that to mention you're going to hear Paul write about how a person goes into strict training to win a prize. And this was very common in the Corinthian culture. So with all of this, let me come back to our prominent look. When you think about Corinth, it was a place of great disparity, from wealthy to poor, to citizens and non-citizens, religious and non-religious, slaves and slave owners. And so much of what Paul writes in 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians, if you take into consideration the culture, man, you can hear the culture in what he writes to them, in challenging Christians and believers to live higher. But let's come back now to Acts and watch his time in Corinth. So it says there he met a Jew named Aquila and a native of Pontus. Remember, we looked at that at the very beginning, that north part with Bithynia and Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla because Claudius had ordered all the Jews to leave Rome. Paul went to see them, and because he was a tent maker as they were, he stayed and worked with them. Every Sabbath he reasoned in the synagogue, trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. His preference, being a synagogue, leverage the Torah, leverage the prophets as the tool for pointing to Christ. Now let me just lean on one thing. I've showed this before at an earlier time with Claudius. Claudius came after Caligula. You have Caesar Augustus. We read about him and the birth of Jesus. We read about the beginning of the Pax Romana under Caesar Augustus in light of the death of Julius Caesar. Tiberius is the emperor of Rome and Jesus is crucified. And then there's a small window of time where Caligula, the famous wheels off, very immoral Caligula, led Rome. And then it was Claudius. And Claudius begins pushing Jews out of Rome. And along with that, Christians got lumped into that. But it was really a press against the Romans, press against the Jews there in Rome. And I mention this simply to show who follows is Nero. Nero will be the one that creates the martyrdom of Paul and Peter. And so with Claudius, you have the beginning points of persecution towards the church. But coming back to Acts, you have when Silas and Timothy came from Macedonia, so they finally get down with Paul in Corinth. Paul devoted himself exclusively to preaching, testifying to the Jews that Jesus was Christ. But when the Jews opposed Paul and became abusive, he shook out his clothes in protest and said to them, your blood will be on your own heads. I'm clear of my responsibility. From now on, I'll go to the Gentiles. So he will stop teaching at the synagogue and prioritized more marketplace ministry, so to say. Then Paul left the synagogue, went next door to the house of Titius Justus, a worshiper of God. Now I want you to just watch some words here. Crispus, the synagogue ruler. Keep that in mind. Crispus, the synagogue ruler. And his entire household believed in the Lord. And many of the Corinthians who heard him believed and were baptized. So Paul has left the synagogue. He's gone to just the door of somebody who was a worshiper, next door, let's say, or close by. And Crispus, who was the synagogue ruler, he also believed. You will find very rapidly he gets removed from being the synagogue ruler. And there will be a new person named Sosthenes. You'll see that in just a moment. So it says, one night the Lord spoke to Paul in a vision, do not be afraid, keep on speaking, do not be silent, for I am with you. No one is going to attack and harm you because I have many people in this city. So God has given him a vision, confirming you're about to have opposition. It's going to be tough, but don't be discouraged. I'm with you. I'm going to help you. So Paul stayed for a year and a half teaching them the word of God. So lean into verse 11. So he's there a year and a half. Timothy and Silas have arrived. It is in this time that Paul will write 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. Paul writes 1st Thessalonians from Corinth. It's sent back to the church in Thessalonica that we read about in chapter 17 earlier with the persecution. And then he'll follow that up with a second letter. And I won't do a deep dive on the contents of those letters. I'm just simply saying that happens in Corinth. But those letters match exactly what was going on in Thessalonica. So keeping to our Corinth focus, while Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the southern portion, the Jews made a united attack on Paul and brought him into court. This man they charged as persuading the people to worship God in ways contrary to the law. And so they're pushing on the Jewish law, it appears. And I say that simply because of the response. Not so much the law of Corinth, but if you watch the response. Just as Paul was about to speak, Galilee said to the Jews, if you Jews were making a complaint about some misdemeanor or serious crime, like in relation to our laws, it'd be reasonable for me to listen to you. But since it involves question about words and names of your own law, like y'all have this thing that you follow this law of this guy named Moses, and you know that he's violating some of that, and he says, I will not be a judge of such things. So he had them ejected from the court. Now, watch this. Remember, Crispus was the synagogue ruler. Then they all turned on Sosthenes, the synagogue ruler. So Crispus had become a convert, and he appears to have been eliminated, exiled from that position. And Sosthenes is installed as the synagogue ruler. And he would have been part of bringing Paul to trial. So they beat him in front of the court, but Gallio showed no concern whatsoever. Now, here's why I find this to be interesting. And there's theologians and historians have dialogued about this, debated about this, as to is it the same person? You know, this can go a couple different ways. But when you read Paul's letter to Corinth, the first letter, so just follow me here. What we're reading right now, he presently is in Corinth. He will leave, he will go towards Ephesus, he will finish journey, he will write letter after he has started his third trip, his third missionary journey. He will come up into Galatia and to Ephesus, and there he will write 1 Corinthians. And when he writes this letter a couple years later to the Corinthian church, 1 Corinthians, the opening line says, Paul, called to be an apostle of Christ Jesus by the will of God, and our brother Sosthenes. Is it the same guy? Is it two different guys named Sosthenes? That's been argued and debated for a long time. There's the probability that the Sosthenes that is beat in verse 17, the top of your screen, is the same Sosthenes that has had a conversion and is now a follower of Jesus Christ and is part of the church and is accompanied Paul. It would be very, very interesting to know. And there's a debate about whether this is the same Sosthenes. I'm just going to say I think it probably is the same guy. And the reason I say is because Luke goes out of his way in the whole body of Luke's work of the book of Acts to identify names who were converted and followed. We'll touch on this as we get later in the book of Acts. But Luke will take time to identify people like Sopater. Like, who knows of Sopater? But Luke identifies him. He will talk about Gaius coming out of Derbe. He will talk about Aristarchus coming out of Thessalonica. He will talk about guys who were converted that followed with Paul. It's in his pattern. And so for me, I think the fact that he identifies Sosthenes is indication that it probably is the same person. But that's my speculation. Paul stayed on in Corinth for some time. Then he left the brothers and sailed for Syria, accompanied by Priscilla and Aquila. Before he sailed, he had his hair cut off at Cenchrea because of a vow he had taken. Cenchrea is down in the southern portion of the Saronic Gulf. So it would be that east side of Corinth, down in the southern side of the Saronic Gulf. And he has a vow, probably a Nazirite vow. I won't go into the details of that. But they arrive at Ephesus, where Paul left Priscilla and Aquila. He himself went into the synagogue, reasoned with the Jews. That's just his norm. When they asked him to spend some more time with him, he declined. But as he left, he promised, "I will come back if it's God's will." Then he set sail from Ephesus. When he landed at Caesarea, he went up, greeted the church, and then went down to Antioch. Let me show you one more passage. Verse 23. After spending some time in Antioch, Paul set out from there and traveled from place to place throughout the region of Galatia and Phrygia, strengthening all the disciples. And it's here that his third trip began. So I showed you this map. Let me show it to you once again. From Acts chapter 15 all the way to Acts 18, where we've just finished off. It's been AD 50 to AD 52. They started in Antioch, went through Cilicia, Galatia, the red part of Asia, wanting to come south, but the Lord prevented them, kept them up north till they got to Troas. He has this vision, man from Macedonia, journeys across Samothrace over to Neapolis to Philippi in Macedonia, the orange section in the top corner. From there, they're going to come down, and he's going to be in Apollonia. He's going to be in Thessalonica. We're going to read about that in chapter 17, and Berea in chapter 17. In Berea, he's going to leave Silas and Timothy, but he'll travel down to Athens, where we studied tonight. And then he'll travel to Corinth after the Areopagus dialogue and kind of dilemma. How long he was there, we don't know. Eventually, while in Corinth, Silas and Timothy will make their way down to Corinth and join him. And he'll write 1 Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians. Before leaving, because of Cenchrea, he will cut his hair there and he'll travel over to Ephesus, which is back over in Asia, the red area. He'll be there only a short time, and then he'll come all the way down to Caesarea. He'll greet the church there, and then he'll come back up to Antioch and greet the church there. And from Antioch, trip number 3 will begin, and you will find that his third trip follows the beginning point of going back through Galatia, Phrygia, and then he's going to be in Ephesus, and we're going to read and study quite a bit on Ephesus in our next study together. So I hope that's been helpful for you. It's been an exhaustive study. But hopefully this will help you in understanding the journey of Paul, this second trip, Acts chapter 15 through 18, and now we'll get into the body of Acts chapter 18 into 19 as Paul takes trip number 3. Hey, with that said, I hope that's been a blessing to you, and I hope you'll be able to study with us as we journey forward. God bless you, and I'll see you soon.